Welcome to this lecture about climate justice. And it's good to see you here. And there are not so many people, but I'm very happy to have you here. Despite decades of climate negotiations, we are exceeding the safe and just environmental limits. Sadly enough, and yeah, what can we do about it? Is there something that can be done about it? In the lecture of tonight, our guest speaker will argue that only systemic transformation can truly balance sustainability with human needs. And that guest speaker is Joyeeta Gupta, and I thank you for coming up to Maastricht. It's a real pleasure and an honor to have you here. Thank you. And Joyeeta Gupta is Professor of Environment and Development in the Global South at the University of Amsterdam and at the Delft Institute of Water Education. She was awarded the Spinoza Prize in 2023, and that's the highest scientific distinction in the Netherlands, for her research on interconnections between climate crisis, global water challenges, and justice. She also chairs the Earth Commission and has contributed as a lead author to the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, the IPCC. And she travels all parts of the world to tell her story. Please give her a warm applause. The floor is yours, Joyeeta.
Good evening, everybody. It's a beautiful sunny day, so I know it has been a sacrifice to come. But I hope I'm worth it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about almost everything under the sun. So basically, I'm going to talk about the fact that we today live in an unhealthy planet, and people are becoming very sick as a consequence. I'm going to try and talk about why we need justice. And when I talk about justice, I'm talking about it in relation to health, for example. And then I look at the possible solutions, and the solutions I present are in terms of boundaries, foundations, and transformation. Then I zoom into the climate change problem, and eventually I end with the proposal of a global constitution. So, we have a very unhealthy planet today. This planet causes us now 25% of all death and morbidity worldwide. And when we're looking at air pollution kills between 7 and 9 million people annually. If you look at water pollution, up to 2 million annually. You can just add the numbers. All of this is quite devastating to human health. On top of that, 60% of all infectious disease come from the animal kingdom. There are diseases that were there before amongst the animals, and because we have taken away land from these animals, these diseases are traveling from animals to humans. There are toxins in the air, in the water, and they affect our brains. And on top of that, you have climate change, which causes death by heat. It causes large numbers of extreme weather events, and this leads to massive displacement in the global south. So altogether, I would say that we are living right now in a very unhealthy planet, and this is based on the work of UNEP's Global Environmental Outlook 6, which I co-chaired a few years ago. So, when you look at all these different systems, and in blue you can see the system of the Earth, so whether it's air, land, fresh water, oceans, biodiversity, And in green to red, you see if it is causing harm to human health. So basically, even though we have a large number of undocumented illnesses, which are shown in sort of dotted lines over here, what we try to show you is that our health is intimately connected with the health of the planet. So if you look at land degradation, today land degradation causes 3.2 billion people worldwide problems with their health because they are not able to grow the food that they would like to. So when you look at the issues and you ask yourself, who causes this problem? Then basically you see, as in this chart, which shows the privileged on the left and the marginalized on the right, that in general, the more privileged you are, the more you pollute. It's not that you and I eat more breakfasts or lunches, but very often the food that we eat may have traveled very far to come to our plate. Also, our pensions and our insurances invest in systems that are often extremely unhealthy. So the higher up you are on the left side, the more you're likely to pollute the earth through our habits. A lot of red meat consumption, for example, or because we are flying all over the world. So those are the problems. But more than what we are consuming, it's our pensions and how they are invested. If you then look at who is harmed on an existential basis, that means whose health is affected so badly they could die or they could lose their entire property, then again it is the marginalized who are much, much more affected. So low and middle income countries stand to lose a very large percentage of their GDP because of the impacts of climate change. Poorer people also tend to be much more vulnerable. In terms of money, of course, the richer people may be more affected. So this is really about existential impacts. And this difference between who causes the problem and who is seriously affected is one of the reasons why this problem has become so wicked and it's so difficult to solve. Now, I don't know whether you're familiar with the concept of DPSIR, or Drivers Pressure State Impact Response, but basically, most of the environmental institutions use this method to identify how to solve a problem. So basically, what is the underlying cause? What is the direct cause? What is the current state of the environment? What is the impact of the environment on humans? And how can we respond? But that story is only half the story. If you were to look at it from a justice perspective, as we do over here, then we would ask, how do drivers result from, mitigate, or exacerbate inequalities? Or who uses and pollutes resources and sinks? Or who is exposed to benefits and risks? And so on. So you're more or less then focusing not so much on how it happens, but who is responsible. And for justice, this is extremely important to take into account. So let me take you through what is justice. Now, a lot of the people focus on the issue that we can recognize an injustice, but we cannot recognize a justice. What we have tried to do over here is to scan the scholarship from local to global, from conservative to transformative. And then we concluded that conservative justice is not going to solve the problems that we have on this earth. So that led us to move to the transformative side, the ideal side, where we say we need to look from local to global, and we have to continuously iterate this on the right side. Subsequently, I'll give you an example why the conservative justice doesn't work. So let me expand on this a little bit more. When I am at the World Economic Forum and I'm talking to companies, then they say, we can only do that which our shareholders want us to do, or which the CEO or the chief financial officer wants us to do. So if there is harm caused through the entire value chain of the product, that may not affect the shareholders and it may not affect the CEO, so they don't take this into account. From a justice perspective, you also have to look at the issue of who is getting harmed. And this is what is called recognition justice. Recognition justice looks at the other, not just the shareholder, but the other person somewhere far away in the world who is affected by the problem you're causing here. Epistemic justice doesn't just look at Western science, the sort of stuff that you all are learning or are teaching here, but it also looks at other cultures to understand how do they think about the problem. How would they have set up a business? That's epistemic justice. So those are the two starting points of our justice story. And the next step is to see, can we balance interspecies justice, our relation with other species, intergenerational justice, the relation between grandparents and grandchildren, and intergenerational, yes, grandparents and grandchildren, and intragenerational is within one generation, how do we share responsibilities? And this is called the 3I approach, and we try to use this approach to understand how to draw a boundary. And then we say we must have processes. So if I'm making a decision, you should all be invited. You should be able to say what you think. You should be able to discuss. And you should be able to find a way in which you can ensure that everybody is part of the process of decision making. If you look at substantive justice is like understanding what causes a problem. It's about ensuring that everybody has access to food, water, energy, and infrastructure. But it is also about ensuring that we make it possible for everyone to achieve whatever they want to achieve in their lives. I'm going to explain this a little bit more slowly. So I'll go back. So suppose now I've given 10% of a certain amount of water for drinking water purposes. Now there's 90% left. How do I allocate this 90%? If I say the price of this 90% is going to be based on demand and supply, the price will go up so much that most of us will not be able to have a nice bath, for example. And poorer people will not even be able to access the water. So water is not allocated by the market in most parts of the world today. So those are the allocation mechanisms that may cause justice or may cause injustice. And then we apply this. So we have this whole justice story and we apply it. We apply it in terms of ends and means. In terms of ends, we say, what is the boundary of the resource that we are using, whether it is air, water, land, biodiversity? How much can we use? So let me explain that through the second slide. So we are looking at the boundary. Now you might have been hearing about the story of planetary boundaries. Planetary boundaries are boundaries beyond which the system begins to become irreversible. The system may collapse. But long before the planetary boundary sets in, there is massive harm to humans worldwide. And so we ask the question, is the safe boundary proposed by natural scientists also just? So this is an operationalization of the 3I principle. And then we ask, given that the world has agreed in Agenda 2030, that's the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, that everyone should have access to food, water, energy, and infrastructure, a house the size of a parking lot, energy, 3 bulbs and a refrigerator, so very, very little. The SDGs say that everyone should have that. that. So what we did was we looked at what would happen if we give everybody those resources, what would be the impact on the planet. And then the third question is, if there is space in between, how do we allocate that in a just manner between different people, different countries, different communities? This is the result of the work of the Earth Commission, which was published in Nature a few years ago. The red line shows you the safe boundaries. And we looked at safe boundaries for climate, for biodiversity, for water, for nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, as well as air pollution. So, I'm not going to bother you with all the numbers, but for climate change, the number was 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. Because if the Earth warms up more than 1.5 degrees, the number of triggering points that we can trigger are so many that we just don't know how we will be able to survive in that different world. So these are the safe numbers. The question was, is this just? And so we looked at, when is a boundary just? For us, a boundary is just when it minimizes harm to humans, but also to other species. Second, a global boundary, a global number can be very irrelevant. You might have no relationship with a global boundary. And so we started to say that we need boundaries that you can understand, that people can relate to. And also, we need a boundary that is that can be crossed at a local area, so spatially can be mapped worldwide. And of course, a boundary often is quantitative, so a quantity of water, but you also need to have quality. What is the quality of the water that you have? And finally, when you have a boundary, it must be achieved in as just a manner as possible. So, let me give you an example. If the safe boundary is 1.5, we were wondering what is the just boundary. Now in this graph you can scarcely see it, but I'm focusing on the yellow dots at the bottom. That shows you how many people are exposed to very high temperatures and very high humidity. And if you cross a certain level, you can die within 4 to 5 hours. The body cannot sweat anymore. It's called high wet bulb temperatures. And already today, at 1 degree centigrade, 70 million people worldwide are affected by this extreme heat and humidity. So we thought a lot and we argued amongst ourselves how many people should die before we say it's unacceptable. Now, it was very difficult to agree upon that, so eventually for climate change we said, you know, at 1 degree, it's almost 1% of the global population that is affected, not just by heat, by malaria, by extreme weather events, by lack of access to water, so it's pretty high. And so we came with the proposal that 1 degree is the most just target for climate change. And this 1 degree target is not a new target. There were publications pre-1990 which also said that up to 1 degree it is green, between 1 and 2 it is orange, means many parts of the world will suffer, and beyond 2 everybody will suffer. So, using these kinds of arguments, we came up with the blue line, which is the just boundary. So, for example, let's take aerosol pollution. Air pollution globally is a problem beyond a point because it changes the monsoon rainfall patterns. But that has not been crossed. What has been crossed is that 7 million people are dying from indoor and outdoor air pollution worldwide. And that basically meant that we would have to sharpen the air pollution boundary, which is your blue line. And we also sharpened the green boundary. But let me give you another example of a biodiversity target. So for biodiversity, We need to protect between 50 to 60% of Earth for nature. But the more interesting target, in my view, is the fact that every square kilometer of a city or of a rural area should be green. This allows earthworms, bees to move around, but it is also good for your garden, it's good for your mental health, it's good for you all to see trees when you look out of your window. So psychologically, it is really important that every square kilometer has this. And what we find actually worldwide is that in rich neighborhoods, there are lots of trees. You walk out of your house, there's a little park, but in poor neighborhoods, very often you have to pay to enter the park, and you're often squeezed into an area where there are no trees. So this target could help to create a more just sharing of greening worldwide. I can discuss some more of the targets if you are interested. I'll give you the surface water target, which is, I think, a difficult target to achieve because the river flows, and you want it to flow and not be, you don't want to take out more water from the river than 20% every month, which means you must return the water if you take more than 20% back to the river. And you need the river to flow because you need the river for the dolphins and the fish and all the other creatures that live there, but also because that water is also important for the coastal areas. So many of these just boundaries take into account how humans behave and what they need. Now, suppose you have a just boundary. Where are we today in the world? The little earths that you can see show you where we are. We are outside every single safe and just boundary. In terms of climate, we are outside the just boundary, and we are just crossing the safe boundary because last year we crossed 1.5. There's not yet a trend of crossing 1.5, but we are on our way to crossing 1.5. Only the aerosol boundary has not been crossed globally, but it has been crossed locally. What does this mean? It's like a cake. You have a boundary, and all you can eat is the cake inside that boundary, right? So the question is, when you have the safe and just boundary, you're basically saying the amount of land you can use, the amount of air you can pollute, the amount of water you can use is limited. That's the story of this narrative. Now, if you look at it, I told you earlier that justice is not just a noble number. We must see whether something is just in a particular area. And here we try to show you the distribution of these boundaries and how they have been crossed. The darker the red, the more boundaries have been crossed. So if you go to South Asia and a bit of Southeast Asia and a bit of Central Europe, you'll find that many boundaries have been crossed. Only a little bit in North Canada, a bit in Australia is a bit white, and there maybe no boundaries have been crossed. But essentially, this is a global problem. Worldwide, we are crossing these boundaries, not just poor countries. So the first story was, we need to have boundaries. We're outside the boundary, and we need to come inside. Second story, if you're outside the boundary, how can we meet the minimum needs of people worldwide? Because if you meet it, you'll obviously go further out. So we calculated this in a particular way. We looked at the human rights to water, food, energy, and infrastructure. And then we looked at it at two levels, an absolute minimum and a little higher to enable people to escape from poverty. And then we calculated what is the absolute minimum for your survival, and then what is the impact of that on CO2 emissions, on phosphorus, on nitrogen, etc. So we are a large team of 60 authors, and each one of us have expertise in this particular area. And with that, we came up with these kinds of numbers. So this chart begins at 90%. So 0 to 90% is outside the chart. The blue color shows you what is the impact of meeting the basic needs to food, water, energy, and infrastructure. If it is a small amount, it's that orange color. If you give them escape from poverty, it's the pink color. So basically, the message that we have is, if you meet the minimum needs of people worldwide using fossil fuel, you're going to have a 26% additional burden in 2018. We took a pre-COVID year in 2018. And the message then is that meeting minimum needs has to be done with renewable energies in the global south. Okay, so if I now try to explain this in terms of my justice narrative, so the earth is the yellow ball, the red line is your safe boundary, the blue line is your just boundary. The question is, how do we get back in? Now, the blue line is the ends up there. We want to have a boundary that is not only safe, but also just. And then we also said we must meet the minimum needs of all. So we do a mathematical experiment where we say, okay, now we give everybody their basic needs, including all of us in this room. So all of us get 3 bulbs and a refrigerator, a house the size of a parking lot. What is the impact of that? And that is your dotted blue line. And then you can calculate how much space is left over for all of us. Okay? So this is the whole story of how we allocate resources in an experiment as compared to in the world outside, where people just go out and buy resources and don't worry about their footprint. So what have I been talking about so far? The white column is the safe and just space. The orange is the overshoot. The dark red is what would happen if we met minimum needs. What are we trying to do? We're trying to reduce our impact and stay within the safe and just boundary, but ensuring that everybody on Earth has the right to basic needs. In this calculation, we have not accounted for access to clothes, maybe a telephone or internet, schooling, and primary health care. So really the minimum of those, we haven't done that. And if we do that, it will be a different story. And maybe you will come back and tell me, oh, but there are too many people on Earth. Maybe. But meeting the minimum needs of the poorest is equal to the impact of the top 4%. So we're talking about the top 4% having a similar impact as almost half the world's population. So this is a very complicated figure that we published in the Lancet Planetary Health Earth Commission report, which I led. And there you see on the left side that in 2018, if you meet the minimum needs of people worldwide, it is just below the maximum. But if we continue as we are currently doing in 2050, even if all of us have only got 3 bulbs and a refrigerator each, there is no corridor. We are outside the safe and just space. There is a little bit more space in some of the other areas, and some of the other areas also have to be calculated. But the message what we are trying to say is that the environmental footprint and impact of people is very different worldwide. And if you cross that 1.5 degree storyline, then the upper map shows you the global tipping points, and the lower map shows you the local tipping points. And in the global tipping points, for example, the Atlantic circulation, that is really important, because if that collapses, the Netherlands would be extremely cold. Everything would change in the way people live today. If you go to the regional tipping points, let's take the Himalayas. If the Himalayas continue to melt and the melting pace increases, then what will happen is there'll be a lot of flooding for the next 20, 30 years, and then there is no storage of water for a region stretching from China all the way Vietnam. All these areas are also dependent on these Himalayas, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and maybe up to Afghanistan. So it's going to be a huge problem for all these people. And if you look, this one is the story about biodiversity. And I said to you earlier, one of our targets is every square kilometer should have 20 to 25% green on average. This particular target, you can see how it is implemented worldwide. The darker the blue, the better the implementation. The more yellow the place is, the worse the implementation. And we in Europe are not doing that well. Here are some more maps where we try to look at how different boundaries relate to per capita occupation of a particular area, to try and show you what it means in terms of justice at that local level in different parts of the world. So our report concluded that if you're outside the boundary, and if meeting basic needs as required by the SDGs pushes you further out the boundary, then how are we ever going to get in? And the only way to get in is when you transform the entire economic and legal system, and you transform the political system, and when you start rethinking how we allocate resources amongst people. And this is the pop-up museum that is moving around Amsterdam right now, showing you the safe and just boundary and trying to help people experience what the paper was all about. Let me now zoom into climate change. So on the x-axis you have time, on the y-axis you have greenhouse gas emissions. And basically you have to get your CO2, methane, N2O, and other greenhouse gases down to zero. Now, getting these gases down to zero means that every year the amount you can emit is shrinking. And what this means is that in 1990, when the negotiations started, the cake was growing in size. So we could chat with each other and discuss with each other about how to share. But as you move towards 2030, 2050, we are going to fight with each other as to who has the right to emit greenhouse gases. And because many of our governments are afraid to do that, they are emitting too much. And as a result, there are impacts all over the world, and there's a justice movement beginning to become very strong worldwide. And this justice movement is calling for action, even in the Netherlands, with the Urkenda case, for example. And of course, technology can help, but we have to be careful not to wait for technology, because ever since I have been working on climate change, we have just been waiting for technology to come. Now, let me give you another little story. When I was working on this 35 years ago, we had a sort of inverted U-curve. Rich countries were on the right side of the curve, and they thought that they could become richer and richer while reducing their pollution. Poor countries were on the left side of the curve, and their emissions were going to go up before they would come down, was the expectation. So rich countries offered poor countries technology and hoped that the poor countries would jump across. Today, that is not the story. Actually, it has not been the story since 1995, because we knew that it's not an inverted U-curve, it's an N-shaped curve. Rich countries are up there, and they have to get to zero. Poor countries are here, they have to get to zero. They can't afford to become like the rich countries, because then they will get locked in and they won't be able to escape. Rich countries don't like this story because they cannot sell their technologies then to the global south. Poor countries don't like this story because they want to get richer. The third story on this slide is that the longer we postpone the highest point of our emissions globally, the more rapidly we have to come down. So if in the Netherlands in 1990, we had decided that we will go up and slowly come down, it would have been a relatively painless process. And instead what we did was keep postponing it to the next prime minister till we reached the prime minister who can't do it, and then basically says, let's not do mitigation in Holland, let's just do adaptation. And you are seeing the same pattern also in other parts of the world. So, why is climate a justice issue? Because all the countries in red are the ones with the highest per capita emissions. All the countries in red in this slide are the ones that are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. By the way, this does not mean that we in the Netherlands are not vulnerable. A few days ago on radio, I heard that many of the houses on poles may have to redo the entire infrastructure because the groundwater level is falling. We too have a problem because our farmers are facing a changing climate. So it's not just that it will be in the developing countries, the pain is much higher in the developing countries. So let me talk about the wedding cake of climate injustice. We knew in 1990 that we should go for 2 degrees and hopefully for 1, and yet we postponed it till 2015, 25 years later. And this means that while many of you were growing up in the Netherlands or abroad, we were allowed to continue using fossil fuel in the global north. Now, if we had known the size of the complete cake in 1990, we could have shared it in some kind of an equitable manner with other countries. Because we delayed it till 2015, the cake is now so small that it's impossible to share. And because it's impossible to share, the Paris Agreement says every country should do what it can. And now if you add up what every country is doing, we are on our way to 2.7 degrees centigrade. But this calculation is based on the idea that the cake is finite. So this brings me to stranded resources and stranded assets. We in the global north have more or less finished all our coal, gas, oil, while the developing countries still have 78% of the remaining fossil fuels. So when I'm teaching in Klingendaal in the Netherlands to colleagues, diplomats from the developing world, and we talk about this issue, many of them come up and say, we will use our fair share of oil and gas and coal, which is in our territory. So the fact that we did not leave a fair share for them doesn't mean that they will not use their fair share. And if they use their fair share, everybody suffers. And that is a big problem. Another aspect of this is that the fossil fuel economy is worth between $16 trillion to $295 trillion US. And the global GDP is around $105 trillion. So the fossil empire is worth either 1/5 or 3 times as much as the global GDP. And so if you think this through, you know who is running our prime ministers, whose phone call they take. Because obviously this empire is very, very powerful. Let's talk mitigation. Mitigation means reducing your emissions of greenhouse gases. In the 1990s, when this was supposed to be done, many rich countries thought that's too expensive to reduce our emissions. So let's just do it where it's cheap. We'll write a check, we'll give the check to some developing country, we'll send some small technology there, reduce their emissions, and we will be better off. And for a very long time, we just did this quick check to buy emission reductions elsewhere. What we did not do was to tell everybody in the Netherlands, in the global north, climate change is a serious problem. Climate change is going to affect you when you get older, and your children, and your grandchildren. It's going to make the world much worse. We didn't tell them that, and as a result of this, most people who did not study about climate change in school or college have no idea what this climate change business is, and they don't care. And as a consequence, they are voting in governments that do not believe in climate change. And this makes it very difficult to then go back to the developing countries who are saying, but somebody has to help us do the energy transition. Somebody has to pay us compensation for loss and damage. And then I have to tell them, but that's not possible because democratically we have voted in a government that will not do that. So this is a really big problem with the way in which the market mechanism functioned. Then we come to adaptation. Adaptation is around $15 million per hour. I heard recently from the European Union that this $15 million per hour is an understatement because Europe is suffering much more than they had anticipated from fires, from floods, and water problems. Also heat-related deaths. And then the last injustice is what causes climate change. So when you look at what causes climate change, it comes down to the simple thing that we all want to get richer. The Netherlands wants to get richer, middle-income countries want to become high-income countries, low-income countries want to become middle-income countries. And everybody thinks fossil fuel is the passport to economic wealth. And nobody is taking into account the fact that when you extract fossil fuel, you pollute the water and the soils, that when you transport fossil fuel, you take a lot of energy. When you use it, again, you're polluting the air. So these are your 6 climate injustices. All right, let me explain the concept a little bit of stranded asset. These are the coal mines on the earth, the small white dots. If the dot is white in color, it has perhaps 5 to 10 years more to finish its job of giving coal to us, mostly in the global north. When the white dot is actually dark red in color, those are new coal mines with a long life ahead. So if you close down a coal mine in its childhood, the amount of money you lose because of the investment you made in creating the mine, the number of people employed who think they have a long-term job is enormous. And that is the reason why in Asia and in South Asia and in Southeast Asia, right now there's a huge amount of problems because those mines have a long life. And one of the reasons why those mines were built in the last so many years is because they thought the global north is not getting off fossil fuel, because we didn't make any commitment till 2015. Okay, so that was the story about the adaptation costs. And this is a slide prepared by the World Economic Forum. And basically what they are saying is all of us are sitting around the table, but we have no idea how big this whole climate problem is. We don't understand that every 1 degree centigrade rise in temperature means a 7% increase in water vapor in the air. The clouds get so heavy, they just fall. In one day, you get the rainfall of a month, sometimes even a year. That's what happened last year in Valencia. And this evaporation on the other side is causing that area to become completely dry. So it's unbelievable how complex the impacts of climate are. In all this, let's talk about one of the key actors, the oil and gas companies. Already in 1950, these companies knew about climate change because the topic of climate change has been researched for more than 2.5 centuries. What they did was, from 1950 to 1970, is to cast doubt and say there's no such thing as climate change. Then they started to question the science, but isn't there an ice age coming? Isn't it getting colder in the upper atmosphere, etc.? Then they had so much profits, they were lobbying and lobbying with governments, and then they moved to revolving door. One NGO worked out that there were 71 cases of company officials who went into the European Union official positions, and European Union official positions went into the companies. So this was the phase of denial. Now we are in the phase of delay, where they are all the time saying, but you need us, you know, the energy transition will be so slow. In the meanwhile, you need us. Gas is the transition fuel. Or they will be greenwashing and saying, yes, yes, we are investing in renewables. When you look at exactly how much money they spend on renewables, it's less than 1% of their total financial resources. If you look at the fact that they are all the time talking about technological optimism, you know, don't worry, carbon capture and storage will solve this problem. Carbon capture and storage is catching the carbon from the air and then finding a place under the ocean or in a mine to put it. Very, very expensive. If the oil companies were going to charge us for putting all this gas under the ground, none of us would be buying oil and gas because we're too expensive. And then the last thing that they are doing is called strategic blame displacement. You want to drive the car, it's your fault. You want to cook on gas, it's your fault. You know, it's not my fault. I'm just doing what you want, and that is strategic blame displacement. So this has been a really big problem. And when you look at the way various banks are working, you will find that some banks are partially forbidding some gas, some oil, some experiment here, some digging up there, but it's not like they're really getting their act together to say no to fossil fuel extraction. Here I have in this slide 4 tragedies and 4 opportunities. I have many, many more tragedies. But the first tragedy is governments, companies, households. My emissions don't matter. I am so small. I only have 1% of the world's emissions. I don't count. The response to that is every emission counts. The second one is, for example, the city of Amsterdam. It often says, I'm spending my money well. But actually, Amsterdam earns from the port of Amsterdam where fossil fuel comes in. And Amsterdam has also got shares in Schiphol where fossil fuel is also burnt. So the question is, and this is not just about Amsterdam, look at philanthropy. Many philanthropists invest in all kinds of polluting companies. But the money that they collect then, the interest that they collect, they may spend well. There's no consistency in the income and expenditure. Some countries say, I'm so large, I can't do anything. There are some very large countries, but actually they have the critical mass for change. And then some companies say, why should I take action? Because nobody else is doing. And I think that every single company, every single university should take scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 seriously. Scope 1 is the emissions in the building. Scope 2 is the emissions caused by the electricity used in a building. And scope 3 is all the products we buy in a university or in a business. Scope 3 is somebody else's scope 1. So there is double counting, there is triple counting, but that's good because then you help all the SMEs who are giving products to us to also change. Because if we don't do that, nothing will happen. MSc student of mine went to SME after SME after SME to ask, what are you doing about climate change? And then they say, oh, we are so small, we can do nothing. So we have to get everybody on board. And what we have to also make sure in a country like Netherlands, or actually any Western country, you know, all the subsidies went to rich people to buy Tesla cars or to buy solar panels or to buy heat exchange pumps. They didn't go to the municipality to help every single neighborhood become green. And that was a mistake because now it's those people who are going to say, we are not going to change our behavior because we can't afford it and will vote in governments that are not interested. So what we are seeing in my story, and I'm going now beyond climate change a little bit, is that of course we have fossil fuel, but we should not use it. But if you look at land or you look at water, it's more or less limited. And fertile land is very limited because land is getting degraded. Clean water is very limited because water is getting polluted. Strategic minerals and metals are limited. So we're talking about a scarce resource. Now, when you talk to a standard economist or a standard capitalist, they'll say if you have a scarce resource, you should price it. That's efficient. And you let the market then distribute the resource. And very often, the economists are in hands with the lawyers, and so the lawyers write up these beautiful contracts that are extremely secretive, and when something goes wrong in that water contract or that energy contract or the mining contract, then it goes to secret arbitration under international private contract law. That's one way in which people deal with scarcity. The second way in which people deal with scarcity is they say, I'm not going to share. My country first. And then you find upstream countries not sharing their water downstream with downstream areas. You will find others saying, I am not going to export certain resources that are needed by others in the world. This is called hegemonic power. And basically, the narrative of hegemonic power is we are going to avoid multilateralism, we are going to focus on sovereignty and securitization of resources. We are not going to share. I'm not going to name names, but obviously this is something that is happening right now in many parts of the world. The third option is Elinor Ostrom's polycentric narrative, that there are many centers of governance, and each of these centers of governance is experimenting, can do self-management, and maybe that's one way to solve it. I think that that made sense some time ago, but today when we are outside the boundaries and haven't yet met minimum needs, I think in that situation, these kinds of polycentric approaches will not help. And so this brings me away from the rational actor model embodied in those three options to talk about what is called a social practice model. A social practice model is when I am nice to you because you are nice to me and we work together. It's collaboration, it's solidarity, it's the fundament of international law. And basically, in that model, you try to find a way to solve problems. In all these years that I've been giving this presentation, I've been moving slowly and more towards the idea of a global constitution. And I think that's what we need, because we need to come together, not pull apart. Otherwise, we will never be able to live within the boundaries, whether they are local or global. And this brings me to my invitation to all of you, because in this Global Constitution project that I am currently working on, we are inviting anybody and everybody above the age of 10. So you, your siblings, your children, your parents, your grandparents, anybody, you can write an essay for about 1,000 words about what you think you want to see in a global constitution. And all those essays that come in get bundled. It can be in any language. We are hoping Google Translate will help us. We will publish them hopefully in the language you submit it in. Every 50 essays goes onto our website, globalconstitutionwithoutspace.org. And all the ideas in those constitutions are used by the PhDs to develop the narrative of the global constitution. And I will also, of course, be part of that. And this global constitution storyline is also in a pop-up museum moving around. So it's 1,000 words, whatever you like, that you think is important to make the world a healthy place. And with that, I'd like to end this presentation. I started talking about the fact that we live on an unhealthy planet with causing people's health to crash. Based on that, we moved to the concept of what is justice. Justice is for well-being, human health, etc. And from there, we talked about the boundaries, the safe boundaries, the just boundaries. And from there, we moved on to, can we meet minimum needs within those boundaries? What is the transformation needed? Then I zeroed into climate change to discuss the climate change problems today. And then I went back out to discuss what I think is needed for addressing all these problems, a global constitution. Many thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Gupta. Are there any questions? Raise your hand and I'll come to you, or I will pass on them. Can you pass it on?
Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned global constitution, and I would like to ask, yeah, it was actually my global environmental law exam question. I'm a master's student at Law for Sustainable Europe department. The question, part of the question was about whether managerial approach is effective anymore, thinking of the Trump leaving Paris Agreement. So you talk about global constitution, but there are a lot of factors, and there's a problem with international law. We saw plastics treaty collapsing recently, and now Trump left the Paris Agreement again. So how are we going to solve international agreement side of it?
So if you don't look at environmental agreements and most other agreements work, you know, agreements on shipping, agreements on communication, a lot of the international legal instruments work. When you go to the environmental issues, the problem is reciprocity. It's very difficult because it's so diffuse. You know, you don't know who's emitting and who's getting affected. And the environmental treaties are much more difficult to implement. I think, and that's a hopeful thought, that we are in a current 4 or 5 years of an aberration. I think at the end of the next 4 or 5 years, the world will be wanting more collaboration. And even if they don't want, it is our jobs as lawyers, as scholars, to try to convince everybody that there is no future in a world where everybody fights for themselves. It has to be all of us coming together to work on issues of plastic or ocean acidification or climate change. We just have to work together. If we don't, the thing collapses. And I think if we start focusing on the failures, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So when you see it at its darkest, it's time we can stand up and fight.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. Picking up on what you just said about like standing up and rise and fight together, do you think realistically speaking, like change will come more from a top-down approach, so more like from governments and like international treaties, and yeah, also there's problem with compliance as you mentioned, but yeah, top-down or more realistically speaking like grassroots?
Change can come from anywhere. It's very unpredictable, but I can tell you that, for example, in our constitution, we are hoping to have at least 500 contributing authors through these essays. But if possible, if we can make it go up, we would like to have many, many. So it would be a constitution of the people. That would be the idea of the draft. And the question is always in these kinds of situations is that if you look at governance, you find that there is a period of peace, then there's a period of collapse. There's a period of peace, and there's a period of collapse. So if you take climate change, it was going really fast in 1992, then 1997 was also not so bad, and then it started to collapse 1988 onwards, and then it had a second collapse after 2008 because of the economic problems in Europe and in the US. But in 2015, we still managed to come together and adopt the Paris Agreement. But then again, you had COVID in Syria, so you know, there were other problems that came up, and then they took a lot of energy out of the system. But I think that if I look at the situation now, you're seeing it as really an intergenerational problem. You're seeing young parliamentarians and young politicians wanting to address environmental issues, whereas the much older parliamentarians are less interested because they don't understand what climate change means. So I think in some ways we are having a generational challenge right now, and I think the young people have to be both on the street, writing papers, getting jobs, and getting into parliament. Otherwise you won't get the changes you want.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a quite superb presentations regarding the climate consequences. This is Imrana from Pakistan, and I belong to Balochistan. My city is Turbat, T-U-R-B-A-T. It's among the globally 7th hottest region. I was expecting few consequences of social consequences, like as a psychologist by professionals, as a climate activist. I work after flood 2022 in Pakistan, particularly in Balochistan. I observed the consequences. It's not just only the eat ups and down, the distributions of water. It's more than that in the particular region. Like in Balochistan, in 2 years on emergency project, I was engaged and working on the climate emergency project, where I found the early child marriages got increased due to the climate consequences in that regions. Like climate consequences due to the flood, and the flood got impact on the financial burden, then financial burden got increased and direct impact and increase at a particular region, the early child marriages. The burden of their load of financial, they do their child marriages. So on that specific duration, I analyzed it is not only the this is not only the health, there are social consequences we are facing as well. Early child marriages was severely impacted. And the peak hours, like we were working on the gender-based violence, and the peak hour, like it was my own analysis that especially 1 o'clock till 3 o'clock, it was the highest temperature recorded in that time. The gender-based violence, physical violence was increased, and we noted down the cases on these. We asked the beneficiary, the client, the woman, which time, like they reported. This was exact time when our earning member of the family came back from their jobs at the 2 o'clock or 1 o'clock. They were terribly aggressive. They beat us.
So it's not just happening in Pakistan, it's happening worldwide, because high temperatures are associated with greater aggression. And you're absolutely right about that. Also, climate change is associated with much, much more male aggression. It's also called a patriarchic disease. If you look at also oil companies and gas companies are often very much male-oriented companies. The men are very rich and they need women, so then they get they kidnap women. They have a lot of rapes in this. The whole story, if you look at it from a gender perspective on climate change, is horrific. You're absolutely right. And for that is the reason why we said that 1 degree we were pushing the 1 degree narrative, and everybody was telling us, don't do that because we've got 1.5, just hold to 1.5. And I'm saying no, because 1.5 is going to make it much worse. We already, I told you, crossed 1.5 for 1 year. We haven't yet set a trend. So at 1 degree, the temperature rise was much less compared to what it's now. And there is, you're absolutely right, but it's not just in Balochistan, it's all over the world. Heat-related gender violence.
Yeah, my question sort of ties to what to the debate that Imrana just opened, and I was also wondering if maybe you're familiar with any research that was done on climate justice that is specifically focused on the feminist perspective of it?
There's a lot.
And if yes, then is there any names you can recommend, or any resources that you think that would be a good place to start or to focus on?
I can give you some names during the break, but there's a whole bunch of gender scholars. I'm not one of the gender scholars, but I've had 2 PhDs working on child marriage, one in Pakistan and one in Nepal. So but gender is not my topic, but it is very much a part of climate change, and climate change is also seen as a neo-colonial disease. So you don't go to a country and grab it, but you behave in such a way that that country is no longer able to access water. So there are a large number of behavioral patterns associated with those in power vis-a-vis those who are affected, and even when they are affected, again, there is a power struggle there also, which leads to the child marriage increases.
Thank you for your speech. You mentioned the enormous power of the fossil fuel industry. I would say now is the time of monsters. Why do you think they would abide to a global constitution?
The idea for global constitution is really, it's an academic project. It's really about trying to get the most perfect project rather than trying to have something negotiated which is not perfect. Obviously, people in power will not like a constitution because a constitution is above people. That is the idea of a constitution, that it is not, it's above the king, it's above the CEO, it's above the CFO. But the point that you're trying to make is very valid. But my gut feeling is that most oil, coal and gas, not coal so much, but oil and gas entities, companies, their money is in the gas and coal, gas and oil. So unless they can sell the gas and oil to somebody, they cannot encash that money. And so I think they are facing an existential crisis, and they knew that in 1950. And because they knew that in 1950, they have started this whole manage the narrative, orchestrate the narrative to survive. But in the end, if we have one government that says instead of because Netherlands is subsidizing fossil fuel quite incredibly, and even recently in the newspapers there was a story of rising prices and the government was going to subsidize the households to pay for it. The governments could have also said, we are going to help these households get off fossil fuel and get onto renewables with that money. So as long as governments continue to subsidize the fossil fuel purchases, it's going to be a problem. But I think one day we will wake up and it will not be there. And I'll give you two stories on that. Can I? The first story is my professor in India, in Bangladesh. I had an examiner from Bangladesh at the Free University here. And at dinner time in 1997, after my PhD defense, I said, you know, I don't see a way out of this climate crisis. That's 1997, a long time ago. And then he said to me that when he was growing up, he never thought the British would go away. And one morning he woke up and the English had left. And more recently, I have a friend who lived in Berlin, behind the wall. And the night the wall came down, he said they were so scared. They could not believe that the wall would come down. They were watching on TV. And the next morning, the wall was down. And they could go in. So you don't know. These things happen overnight, and I am going to put all my energy and my hope in yours that this is going to change, and that this 5-year period is an anomaly. We are having lots of wars right now in different parts of the world. Maybe 5 years down the road, we will say no, and many more people will join us in saying no to all these different ways of breaking the law, which even the oil companies do.
Thank you. Thank you for your speech. I sometimes hear the story that in the 70s we had lifestyles which were within the boundary and still we were happy. Or was it the 60s? Or was it the 50s? Can you comment on that?
That we were outside the boundaries in the 50s?
That people lived within the boundaries of the planet and still had, you know, the rights of...
They were also happy then?
Happy.
Oh, but you know, happiness has nothing to do with your income. When I was growing up in India, I was very happy. I wasn't that rich at all. You know, it was 1960s, 70s. I'm still very happy, but now I'm much richer. I don't think it has that much to do with your wealth. I think also that a lot of the stuff that we do actually creates more problems for us. Right now, my kitchen is full of all kinds of machines. Maybe I don't need all those machines because I could, you know. So in many ways, you can think that it's not, your happiness doesn't depend on your equipment. Your happiness depends on your family, your friends, your relationships, your work satisfaction. So I completely agree that people were happy in the 60s. In some parts of the world.
Thank you very much for your lecture. It was very, very shocking about the numbers. And I wanted to ask you how, if you are working on getting more fine-tuned the local measurements for the local boundaries in safe boundaries and also just boundaries, and how having that measures well-tuned will help to get local governments, for example,
more active
into the idea of being part of the constitution and the systematic change.
I think there are three different stories there. The first story is, do we have enough data about the pollution? And that's really quite complicated because in some areas we do have a lot of data. So in air pollution, we have a lot of data, but if you are going to look at where PFAS is in the water, in many parts of the world, it's not very clear, or where the water has got eutrophied by nitrogen or phosphorus. It's clear in Europe, but in other parts of the world, the data is not that great. So you also have a whole problem of data injustice because sometimes you do things without the data and you don't know whether you're doing it right or not. So the first part is the data story. And I think the second part is getting municipalities to act. The problem for most municipalities is the thing, if I ignore the environment, I can get richer faster, my neighborhood, my area. And so what a lot of municipalities have done since the 1990s is to ignore the environment. When I studied law in pre-1990, the idea was that you had environment impact assessment. And by doing that environment impact assessment, you only said yes to those projects that did not pollute the environment. You had ambient water standards, you had ambient air pollution standards. So if you had a water body here with a standard, you could say how much nitrogen the farms around it can emit. All that, the instruments were all there. And then in 1990, you see deregulation. You see that everybody is saying business can't survive if there are too many laws, there are too many problems for business. And so the regulations became weaker and weaker, and governments became leaner, so they didn't have the data themselves. They had to depend on the companies for the data. And as a consequence, today you find that even in one of the richest countries in the world, the Netherlands, our waters are polluted with nitrates. You find that in the UK, the air pollution is so high that children are dying, and there has been now a court case forcing the London municipality to try and meet the air pollution standards. So even in rich countries, there's a problem. In the poorer countries, you see the pollution. In the rich countries, you don't always see the pollution, but it is there.
First you, and then we'll continue.
Hi, thank you for your presentation, first of all. And I wanted to say, like, we have talked a lot about like government engagement or companies, corporation, and so. But I wanted to ask about like societal engagement. Like, what can we do to? Because as you said, like, a lot of it is like the system, like in the capitalist system that we live in, but the consumption, the overconsumption, and like we believe we should have access to everything that we want whenever we want. So I think a lot of responsibility lies also within ourselves and like our awareness and our commitment also, like for example about the footprint that you also mentioned, like we see things, we don't wonder where they come from. So how can we become more aware of that, or how can we engage or provoke society to, because I think it's mostly depending on us, the change also.
So when we did the research in the Earth Commission, the results frightened me as well, because the numbers were quite frightening, because Professor Fuchs and I think you're going to also have one more professor coming here, Robijn, yeah, she's also coming, and she works on limitarian standards, and those are the maximum you are allowed to emit. So how many kilometers are you allowed to drive, or how many clothes can you buy, or, you know, so there's a maximum limit based on your footprint. So Robijn's works more on a philosophical way, Professor Fuchs works with numbers, and now we are trying to actually calculate, because we calculated the space to see what it means. And I think that will be quite frightening for many of us, because we might think eventually, oh my God, you know, I should have only one computer for 10 years and not 5 computers buying every 2 years, or telephones. So the situation has changed now. I think the process of educating the public has to be done differently. It cannot be like you should not have more than one telephone. It has to simply be, do you need another phone, and does it make you happy? I think we have to change the narrative some way. I'm not an expert, I'm not a psychologist to be able to communicate that, but I think we have to find a way to explain to people that even if you have a lot of money in your pocket, you can't buy anything because you don't have that footprint. That's not yours to buy. And I don't think it matters so much for you guys, because if you look at Oxfam, their research shows, for example, that an Australian billionaire in 1 hour on his ship, personal ship, his luxury ship, he emits as much emissions as an average Australian over a whole year. So maybe we have to first figure out the super rich people and try to see how we can reduce their lifestyle a little bit within their permits. But on the other hand, you can also look at it from the perspective of permits. So you can tell the company there's only so much of water and air pollution that you can have, so you can only sell so many phones. Because ultimately the company is responsible. Because if you don't buy and the company is stuck with it, it doesn't make any difference, it doesn't help. So we have to do it both production and consumption.
There are a lot of questions, so please keep your questions short, I hope.
Okay, I actually studied European public health, and last period we studied environment and health, and we had to create a case study. Basically, we realized that regarding disaster preparedness, countries in Europe are not ready at all, even if we are facing already the consequences. I was wondering why the plans about natural disaster in general, they don't work and they are not effective and they are not helpful for the population.
I don't know. I haven't really researched this question, but I can tell you intuitively what I think has happened. Every 4 years, the government changes. New ministers come in. New people come in with new visions, new ideas. And as I said earlier, most people who have not studied climate change in school or college, or are not exposed to it because they're teaching it, they have no idea what it is. It's just a word for them. And because it's just a word for them, they think, oh, you know, you like climate, I don't like climate. It's like as if climate is a left-wing thing, not a right-wing thing. Climate is a thing for everybody. And somehow it has got labeled as a left-wing hobby, and which is crazy. And as a consequence of that, I feel that there's a whole bunch of people in these ministries, the ministers who come and the politicians who come, who then decide how and when and what is going to be done. But also educating the public is just not very active nowadays. We have to have regular education of the public, because it's not just climate. I mean, PFAS, who the hell knows what PFAS is? You know, where is it? Is it in your raincoat? Is it in your frying pan? Where is it? We don't know. So we need that education all the time, and that has to come on television or somewhere. And those of you who are living in your telephone bubbles, you will never get educated, because you'll only know what you look for. So somehow we have to find a way to fight misinformation, disinformation, and on the other hand, to be able to really educate the public all the time, especially because we're living longer.
Hi, thank you for the fascinating lecture. I'm very interested in environmental law, and I was wondering what you thought of climate litigation, what you thought of the role and the future of climate litigation, and if you...
Yes, I think the climate litigation is the way in which social movements can try and change government behavior through a legal instrument. And so that's a really important instrument. I think there are right now around 2,200 court cases on climate change worldwide, about 120 against the oil companies, but many are against governments. On the other hand, the oil companies are also coming back with SLAP litigation, that is strategic litigation against public participation. They're trying to make NGOs broke, so that they cannot go to court. So there's a bit of problem there. But on the other, I am really hopeful that the judiciary, as one of the three, the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive, because the executive and the legislature are often influenced by lobbyists, I'm hoping the judiciary is the one that will stand firm as far as possible, if they're not politically interfered with, and that they may be able to help, because they will look up the science if needed on a particular issue. They will call the experts to say, why is there's this problem. So yes, I think environmental law is a good choice, and I think looking at litigation as a really good way to go.
Hi, thank you for your very, very interesting lecture. Going back to your point on education, I was a high school teacher for several years. I now teach at the university here. I see a lot of apathy in young people because they feel like it's already too late. And it's very difficult to have conversations about the severity of climate change with those people without just driving them towards anxiety. So I was wondering if you have ever interfaced with young people on this topic and what you've said to them to try and address that.
So climate anxiety amongst young people is one of the biggest challenges we face in Western countries. And maybe it is also going to come in South Asia. I don't know about that, but I know that in our university, in the University of Amsterdam, also young people are very nervous. In Estonia last week and in Norway, all the universities I'm going to, young people are scared about their future. And I think the most important thing to do is to channel the young people into young scientific scholars that speak out. So I keep telling my students that they should not just try to do something small themselves, but they should try to mobilize a group of 10, or they should try to go house to house to explain to people what things are. They should try to organize a little fair in neighborhoods to explain to people what climate change is. And they need to get out and work. I tell my colleagues that they should be on the road. I'm on the road now almost all the time because I think that I have to tell the story and I have to mobilize people to action. Whether you do a constitution, you don't have to do a constitution, you can also do a court case. You know, you can also do, you go to your parents' neighborhood and you make some juice and you invite people and say, I'm going to talk to you guys about environmental issues because it's my future and it's your kids' future and I'm going to explain that to you. And maybe people come and listen, I don't know, but you have to mobilize that tension into positive energy. If you don't mobilize the tension into positive energy, I've had students who just sort of got like frozen. They couldn't do anything.
I will take 2 questions. Oh, 1 question. Yeah, over there. And then we will end. Evening.
If you want to make people enthusiastic about climate change, I think you must be practical and concrete. Yes? So, for instance, it's in the ICCP is said that nuclear power is really needed for less CO2, yes? So, okay, tell the people in Germany that they shouldn't close their nuclear plants. Or another important issue is war. In Ukraine is war, and war is very bad for CO2 because you have to make weapons that CO2 is used. Yes, if you use them, it's the damage is CO2 and the recovery is CO2. So it's 4 times CO2.
Correct.
So, but nobody talks about it. So
No, they are talking about it. The King of Spain has just done an article, I think it was in the Financial Times, I forget now, it was in a newspaper, where he talks about the fact that maybe we have to talk about war security and climate security together, that they're both security issues and that we need to fight the issues together. There are a lot of people who are working on these issues. The nuclear energy, the IAEA and many nuclear companies are hoping to make a comeback on climate change. I'm not sure that nuclear energy is, by the way, within our footprint, but I would rather say, you know, let's think about, okay, eating less beef, perhaps because you need less land then for those big cows, maybe go and eat more chicken or more sardines rather than, you know, so there are other small things that we can all do, and we can also say we want to have rooms which have more efficient lighting so that you can do demand side management in the global north. In the global south, you might need nuclear if you don't have enough other alternatives. But in the global north, we have the resources to do alternatives to nuclear, but okay, if we have nuclear, we don't need to shut them down, but not to make new nuclear.
Okay. I would like to thank you once again for this very, very interesting lecture. Thank you. And I would like to thank you for coming. We have Ingrid Rubens, you mentioned her already, on Wednesday. It will be a lecture in Dutch, unfortunately, or not, about limitarisme. And what? That's, yeah, okay, but that's in daytime. That's not from Studium Generaal. In the evening, it's in Dutch. And tomorrow we have a film and talk evening with the film Union. So I would like to thank you. Please, one last applause for Joyeeta Gupta. Thank you.